What would make 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent in the middle of a winter night, flee half, dressed into -30-degree temperatures, and walk barefoot into a frozen wilderness knowing they were walking towards certain death? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. But before we descend into the frozen darkness of the Ural Mountains, I need you to ask yourself, what kind of terror is so immediate, so overwhelming, that freezing to death becomes the preferable option? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe in evil. Not supernatural evil, but the kind that wears human faces, because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about what governments hide, what mountains remember, and what really happened on that slope in the dead of winter, 66 years ago. This content discusses real historical events involving loss of life. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered, died, and were left behind. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. If you're sensitive to discussions of death, suffering, or violence, please care for yourself first. In the archives of Sverdlovsk Oblast in Russia, there exists a case file that reads like fiction, except every word is documented, photographed, and verified. Case number 371. 9 bodies recovered over the course of 3 months. Causes of death ranging from hypothermia to injuries so severe they were described as comparable to a high-speed car crash, yet with no external wounds, no signs of a struggle, and one detail that investigators could never explain: traces of radiation on their clothing. We're about to delve into a mystery that has spawned 65 years of theories, cover-ups, and questions that refuse to die, where 9 young, ambitious hikers ventured into mountains that locals called Dead Mountain and never returned alive. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a question about how far governments will go to hide the truth, how nature can become an accomplice to horror, and what it means when the only witnesses are the dead themselves. It was the year 1959. The Cold War had transformed the world into opposing armed camps. The space race was accelerating toward the stars, and the Soviet Union was projecting an image of technological superiority and socialist triumph. But in the remote northern Urals, in a region so isolated that locals still spoke in whispers of ancient taboos and cursed slopes, 9 souls were about to encounter something so terrifying that they chose death by freezing over facing it. Their story would be suppressed for decades, their case files sealed, their families silenced. And when the truth finally began to surface, it would prove that sometimes the most monstrous explanations are the ones that come from human hands. The northern Urals in winter are not merely cold, they are hostile to human existence in a way that defies simple description. Imagine a landscape where the temperature plunges to -40 degrees Celsius, where wind speeds can reach hurricane force in minutes, where white-out conditions can erase the world so completely that you cannot see your hand in front of your face. This is a place where the tree line stops, as if the trees themselves know better than to venture higher. This is a place where the indigenous Mansi people, who have lived in these mountains for millennia, have zones they simply will not enter, not for hunting, not for any reason. The mountain the Mansi call Kal at Sayak, which translates with chilling precision to Dead Mountain, arises from the frozen taiga like a warning. Its slopes are bare, wind-scoured, exposed. In winter, it becomes a monument to desolation. The nearest settlement, Vizhay, sits more than 60 kilometers to the south, itself a tiny outpost of civilization clinging to the edge of the wilderness. Beyond Vizhay, there is nothing but white silence and cold that kills in hours. In January of 1959, This is where 9 people decided to go. But to understand why, we must first understand who they were, because that's what makes this story so disturbing. These were not reckless amateurs. These were not inexperienced adventurers seeking thrills beyond their capabilities. They were among the Soviet Union's best. Igor Dyatlov was 3 years old when he died, 23. A radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, he was known for his meticulous planning, his technical expertise, his calm leadership. He had been hiking and skiing in the Urals for years. He knew these mountains. He respected them. He was, by every account, the kind of person who checked his equipment twice, who planned for contingencies, who did not take unnecessary risks. Zinaida Kolmogorov's Zina to her friends was 22, a fifth-year student, passionate about hiking and nature. She kept a diary that would later be found in the tent, its final entries written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic. She was ambitious, well-liked, engaged with life in the way only the young can be, with that particular intensity that comes from believing the future is limitless. Lyudmila Dubenina, 20 years old, was studying engineering economics. Those who knew her described a woman of fierce determination, someone who approached the mountains with both reverence and confidence. She kept a camera with her constantly, documenting everything. That camera would be found months later, its film still intact, the images it captured among the last photographs these people would ever take. Rustam Slobodin, 23, was a student of engineering and a natural athlete. Alexander Kolvatov, 24, was quiet, methodical, studying physics and engineering. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Yud, in the 2 Uris, were close friends, both 24 and 21 respectively, both experienced hikers who had made this trek their passion. Nikolai Thebox, Brignol, 23, came from a French background but was thoroughly Soviet in his outlook and training. And Semyon Zolotaryov, at 37, the oldest of the group, was something of an enigma even before he died. A veteran, he had fought in World War II, had been awarded medals, had stories he rarely shared. He joined the trek at the last minute, replacing someone who had dropped out. 9 people, combined hiking experience totaling decades, combined age barely reaching 200 years. On the 27th of January, 1959, they boarded a train heading northeast toward the mountains. Their plan was to complete a Category 3 trek, the second, highest difficulty rating in Soviet mountaineering. The route would take them across the northern Urals to Otorten Mountain and back, a journey of roughly 300 kilometers that would require 2 to 3 weeks to complete. Category 3 meant serious business. It meant technical challenges, severe weather exposure, and the kind of conditions that separate enthusiasts from experts. But for this group, it was achievable, expected. They had trained for this. They were ready, or so they believed. There was a 10th hiker. This detail is crucial. Yuri Yudin, 21 years old, started the trek with the others. He was there for the train ride, the initial approach, the first days of the journey. But on the 28th of January, he developed severe joint pain, later diagnosed as sciatica, that made continuing impossible. The group made the decision together. Yudin would return. He was the last person to see them alive. Years later, decades later, Yudin would carry the weight of that decision with a particular kind of survivor's anguish. "If I had been there," he would say in interviews, his voice hollow, "I would have died with them, but perhaps I could have made a difference. Perhaps one more person would have changed something." But he wasn't there, and on the 1st of February, the remaining 9 hikers began the final leg of their journey toward Khalat Sayak. dead mountain. According to their journals and the timeline reconstructed later, they made good progress initially. The weather was cold but manageable. Their spirits were high. Dyatlov's notes show careful attention to navigation and conditions. Kolmogorova's diary entries speak of camaraderie, of shared meals in the tent, of the particular satisfaction that comes from testing yourself against nature and finding yourself equal to the challenge. On February 1st, they began ascending the slopes of Khalat Sayak. The plan was to establish a cache of supplies, then climb to the ridge, make camp, and continue toward Autorten the following day. But weather was deteriorating, visibility was dropping, and at some point the exact time is unclear from the evidence. They made a decision that has puzzled investigators ever since. Instead of descending to the treeline where they could have found shelter, fuel for a fire, and protection from the wind, they chose to camp on the exposed slope of the mountain. More than 1,500 meters above sea level, in the open, in what they knew would be brutal conditions. Why? This is the first unanswered question, and it won't be the last. Among the film recovered from their cameras, there is one photograph that has haunted researchers for decades. It shows the tent being set up on the slope. The image is somewhat blurred, whether from wind, cold, stiffened fingers, or the fading light is unclear. But you can see the tent, see the hikers working, see the vast emptiness of the snow around them. The sky in the photograph is gray, featureless, the kind of sky that promises nothing good. This photograph was taken sometime in the late afternoon of February 1st. By the following morning, everyone in that image would be dead or dying. When the group failed to return on the expected date, February 12th, no one was immediately concerned. Delays were common in winter expeditions. Equipment failures, weather holds, route modifications. All could add days to a journey. The families waited, the university waited, but by February 20th, the waiting had transformed into worry. The families began demanding action. The university authorities, initially dismissive, began to take the matter seriously. And on February 22nd, a search and rescue operation was authorized. This was no small undertaking. The search area covered hundreds of square kilometers of some of the most hostile terrain in Russia. The search teams included student volunteers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, professional rescue workers, local Mansi hunters who knew the region intimately, and this detail is significant military personnel. Why the Soviet military would be involved in searching for student hikers was a question that would take on darker implications later. They searched by foot, by ski, by helicopter. The weather fought them constantly: blizzards, white outs, temperatures that turned flesh numb in minutes. For days they found nothing, until February 26th. The helicopter pilot saw it first, a dark shape against the snow on the slope of Khalat Sayak. The tent, torn, partially collapsed, partially buried in snow. When the ground team reached it, what they found defied all logic and experience. The tent had been cut open from the inside, not at the entrance, not where you would exit if you needed to leave quickly. The slashes were made through the fabric of the tent wall itself, long, deliberate cuts made by people inside trying to get out. This was not the action of people calmly exiting a tent. This was escape. This was panic. This was terror. Inside the tent, the scene was eerily orderly. The hikers' belongings were neatly arranged. Boots were lined up. Supplies were organized. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of an attack, no indication of what could have caused such desperate flight. But most disturbingly, many of their winter clothes, the heavy coats, the insulated boots, the wool sweaters that meant the difference between survival and death in these temperatures, were still in the tent, Some items were laid out as if being prepared for the next day's trek. The lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, stood at the tent site and tried to reconstruct what had happened. The cuts suggested panic, but the interior suggested calm. The abandoned clothing suggested haste, but the organized supplies suggested routine. And then there were the footprints, leading away from the tent, down the slope toward the tree line 1,500 meters below, were tracks in the snow. 9 sets of footprints, some in socks, some barefoot, some in a single boot or felt liner, walking, not running, walking in an almost orderly line down the mountain, away from the tent and everything in it that could have kept them alive. What makes 9 people walk toward certain death? Ivanov would later write in his notes, what was in that tent that was worse than freezing? The search team followed the footprints down the slope. At the edge of the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree, they found the first bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Yudin lay in the snow approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent. They were dressed in their underwear, that's all. In temperatures that would have been -30 to -40 degrees Celsius, they wore only their undergarments. They were found lying close to the remains of a fire they had somehow managed to start using branches broken from the cedar tree above them. The tree itself told a story, branches broken off up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed it, snapping off limbs for fuel. Indeed, searchers found fragments of skin and tissue on the tree bark. Someone had climbed it with bare hands in that cold, had climbed high enough to see back toward where the tent was, had tried desperately to see something, but what? Both men showed signs of extensive frostbite. Their hands were burned, from trying to handle the fire without gloves, perhaps, or from desperately feeding it despite the pain. Yuri Doroshenko's body showed signs he had tried to climb the cedar tree, branches in his hands, bark under his fingernails, abrasions on his skin from the rough wood. The fire had gone out. How long they had survived there, trying to warm themselves with that failing flame, is unknown. But eventually the cold had won. These discoveries were horrifying enough, but they were only the beginning. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies over the following days. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, the one who had planned everything so carefully, was found 300 meters from the cedar, face down in the snow. His body was positioned as if he had been crawling back toward the tent, toward safety, toward the equipment and clothing that could have saved him. He had made it 300 meters, in his underwear, in the killing cold. 300 meters of desperate, futile crawling through snow. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found 430 meters from the cedar tree, also positioned toward the tent. She had made it farther than Dyatlov. Her hands were clenched. Her face was bloodied, likely from falling repeatedly in the snow, trying to get up, trying to keep moving. Rustam Slobodin was found between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova. He, too, had been moving toward the tent. He had a small fracture to his skull, not enough to kill, investigators determined, but perhaps enough to disorient, to slow, to make the cold's work easier. All 3 had died of hypothermia. All 3 had died trying to return to the tent. All 3 had died alone in the snow, separated from each other by hundreds of meters, each one crawling toward a shelter they would never reach. The pattern was clear. They had fled the tent in panic, made it to the cedar tree, started a fire, and then, for reasons unknown, some had attempted to return. But return to what? What had changed? Why would they go back to a place they had fled from in such terror? At this point in the investigation, early March 1959, the search team and investigators had recovered 5 bodies and were facing a mystery that made no sense. The official cause of death for all 5 was hypothermia, but that only answered how. The question of why remained completely unanswered. Why had they cut their way out of the tent? Why had they fled without proper clothing? What had they seen or heard that made freezing to death preferable to staying in their shelter? And where were the other 4 hikers? ### Part B. The pattern completes the search continued through March and into April as the snow began to melt. The area around the tent and the cedar tree was thoroughly examined. The slope was gridded and systematically searched. Helicopters flew patterns over the region. Nothing. It was as if 4 people had simply vanished. But on May 4th, more than 3 months after the incident, a discovery was made that would transform this mysterious tragedy into something far more disturbing. 75 meters into the forest from the cedar tree, searchers found a den dug into the snow beneath the boughs of young fir trees. This wasn't a natural formation, this was deliberately constructed. Someone had cut fir branches and laid them on the ground, creating an insulated platform. It was a survival shelter, the kind that experienced hikers would build if they needed to protect themselves from the elements. Inside this den, under 4 meters of snow that had accumulated over the winter months, they found the last 4 bodies. And these bodies told a very different story. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolvatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thaybox Brignol were found together in the den. They were better dressed than the first 5 victims. Some wore multiple layers, suggesting they had taken clothing from the bodies of the 2 Uris who had died by the cedar tree. This detail is confirmed by forensic analysis. Dubinina was wearing Kolvatov's coat. Zolotaryov wore Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. In the desperate mathematics of survival, the living had stripped the dead. This was rational. This was survival instinct. But it hadn't been enough, because these 4 had not died from hypothermia. The autopsy reports, when they were finally released, contained findings that transformed the entire investigation into something that could no longer be explained by simple misadventure. Lyudmila Dubinina's chest was crushed, multiple bilateral rib fractures. The force required to cause such injuries was, according to the medical examiner, comparable to the impact force of a high-speed automobile collision. Yet there were no external wounds, no bruising, no cuts, just massive internal trauma, and there was something else. Something that the official reports would initially suppress, but that would eventually leak out and haunt investigators for decades. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her upper lip. The tissue had been removed, not torn, not decayed, but removed with what the medical examiner described as precision. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group, the mysterious veteran who had joined at the last moment, also had massive chest trauma. Multiple rib fractures, the same impossibly powerful force applied to his torso, crushing his chest without external injury. Nikolai Thaybox Brignol had a severe skull fracture. Again, the force required was tremendous, but there was no external wound, no indication of what could have struck him with such devastating power. Alexander Kolvatov was the only one of the 4 without massive skeletal trauma, but he too had died in that ravine, in that den, in the darkness beneath the snow. Dr. Boris Vozrozhdeny, the medical examiner who performed the autopsies, was explicit in his report. These injuries could not have been caused by another person. The force required is too great. These are the kinds of injuries you see in high-impact trauma, like car accidents or falls from great heights. But there were no cars on that mountain, no cliffs they could have fallen from in that location, no evidence of an avalanche that could explain such selective, devastating force. The official investigation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and then came the detail that would fuel conspiracy theories for the next 6 decades. When the clothing from the Ravine 4 was tested, a standard procedure in suspicious death investigations, traces of radioactive contamination were found. Not on all items, not even on most, but on specific pieces of clothing, radiation levels were detected that were above normal background levels. The Soviet authorities classified this information immediately. It would not become public knowledge until decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when case files began to be declassified and survivors like Yuri Yudin started speaking more openly about what they knew. Why were there radiation traces on the clothing? Where did it come from? And why was this information suppressed? On May 28, 1959, the official investigation was closed. The conclusion, as written by senior investigator Lev Ivanov, the cause of death was a compelling natural force which the hikers were unable to overcome. Read that phrase again. A compelling natural force, not an avalanche, not an animal attack, not hypothermia alone, not an accident. A compelling natural force. This is the language of someone who has been told what not to say, who has been given parameters within which they must work, who cannot tell the truth but refuses to lie completely. This is bureaucratic code for "we know, but we cannot tell you." The case was closed. The families were given the bodies. And a veil of official silence descended over the incident. Lev Ivanov would live with this silence for decades. But in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he finally spoke. In an interview with a small regional newspaper, he said something extraordinary. "I suspected at the time, and am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to group's death." Bright flying spheres. Ivanov claimed that during the investigation there were multiple reports from witnesses in the region, including the Mansi hunters and even some military personnel, of strange lights in the sky in late January and early February, glowing spheres moving through the night sky over the northern Urals. He claimed he was ordered not to include this information in his official report. He claimed he was told that the area where the hikers died was used for secret military testing. Ordered by whom? Testing of what? These questions would remain unanswered. Ivanov died in 2004, taking whatever else he knew to his grave. For 65 years, the Dyatlov Pass incident has spawned theories ranging from the rational to the fantastical, from the scientific to the supernatural. Each theory attempts to answer the central question: what made 9 experienced hikers flee their tent in terror and walk to their deaths in the freezing darkness? Let us examine what we know with certainty, what we can infer with reasonable confidence, and what remains inexplicable. The certainties: they cut their way out of the tent from the inside. This is not disputed. The cuts were made by knives from inside, by people desperate to escape immediately, people who could not or would not take the seconds necessary to use the tent entrance. They left without adequate clothing. In temperatures that would kill in hours, they fled in underwear and socks. This was not confusion. Their supplies were organized, their boots were accessible. This was a conscious decision driven by immediate terror. They walked, not ran. The footprints showed a relatively orderly descent down the slope. They were not fleeing in blind panic. They were moving with purpose toward the tree line. Some died trying to return. 3 of them attempted to crawl back to the tent. Something changed that made them attempt to return to the place they had fled. The ravine, 4 suffered catastrophic internal trauma, force comparable to severe car accidents, no external injuries. This is medically documented and verified. Radiation was detected. small amounts but above background levels on specific clothing items. This is in the official reports. The case was officially closed with a deliberately vague conclusion. Compelling natural force is not an explanation, it is evasion. The rational theories, avalanche theory, for decades, this was dismissed because there was no evidence of avalanche activity at the scene. But in 2020, a group of scientists published a study suggesting a rare type of delayed slab avalanche could have hit the tent, causing the injuries and panic without leaving obvious traces. The problem: this doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain the removal of Dubinina's soft tissue. It doesn't fully explain why experienced hikers would flee without clothing, rather than simply exiting the tent and assessing damage. And it doesn't explain the lights reported in the sky. Paradoxical undressing theory: in severe hypothermia, victims sometimes experience a sensation of extreme heat and begin removing clothing. This is well documented. The problem: this would explain the state of undress for the first 5 found, but not why they left the tent that way. They were not hypothermic when they fled. The hypothermia came after. Infrasound theory: certain wind conditions in mountains can create very low frequency sound waves below human hearing range that cause feelings of dread, panic, nausea, and irrational fear. The Urals geography could potentially create such conditions. This is actually compelling. It could explain sudden, overwhelming panic that drove them from the tent. It could explain why they walked rather than ran. As the distance from the source increased, the effect would diminish. It could explain why some tried to return once the effect wore off. The problem: it doesn't explain the catastrophic injuries. It doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain the precision removal of soft tissue from Dubinina's face. The darker theories: military testing. The Soviet military was conducting weapons tests in the northern Urals in 1959. This is documented. The radiation traces, the reported lights in the sky, the rapid military involvement in the search, the classified information, the ordered closure of the investigation all point to something government wanted hidden. Possibilities include inadvertent exposure to rocket fuel or radioactive materials from a failed missile test, concussion injuries from a nearby explosion, the hikers witnessed deliberate or accidental targeting by experimental weaponry. This would explain the official silence. It would explain the radiation. It could explain the internal injuries if some kind of pressure wave or thermobaric effect struck them. It would explain why Ivanov was told not to investigate the bright spheres. The problem: how do you reconcile this with the pattern of deaths? The 2 Urus dying by the fire, the middle 3 crawling back toward the tent, the ravine 4 building a den. If they were hit by a weapon, why this pattern? Why not all dead at once? The Mansi theory. Initial investigators briefly considered that the indigenous Mansi people might have attacked the hikers for trespassing on sacred ground. This was quickly dismissed. The Mansi themselves participated in the search and were cooperative. More importantly, the injuries don't match any kind of human attack. And the Mansi had no reason to pursue hikers who regularly passed through the region. The inexplicable elements. No theory completely explains everything. Every explanation leaves gaps, leaves questions, leaves doubt, and some details defy any rational framework. The removal of Dubinina's tongue, eyes, and upper lip. Natural decomposition, possibly except the timeline is wrong, and a medical examiner specifically noted it appeared removed, rather than decomposed. Scavenging by animals, also possible, except the body was under 4 meters of snow. Why would scavengers specifically target these tissues and leave others. The radiation traces, small amounts, yes, but above background, on specific items, where did it come from? If from military testing, how did it get on their clothes? If from contaminated equipment, why only some items and not others? The lights in the sky. Multiple witnesses reported these over several weeks in the region. Ivanov confirmed he had testimony about them. What were they? Military aircraft, rocket tests, something else, the pattern of death. Why did different people make different choices? Why did some stay by the fire while others tried to return? Why did the ravine 4 build a den while the first 2 stayed exposed by the cedar? What were they thinking? What did they know that we don't? The families of the 9 victims spent decades fighting for truth. They were met with official silence, classified documents, and bureaucratic stonewalling. The Soviet state, which had promised transparency and justice to its citizens, offered neither. Yuri Yud, and the only surviving member of the original group, dedicated much of his life to understanding what killed his friends. He participated in investigations, spoke to researchers, reviewed evidence. He climbed back to that pass multiple times, stood on that slope, tried to feel what they must have felt. In a 2012 interview, 1 year before his death, he said something haunting. "If I had been there, I would have died too, but I cannot shake the feeling that I abandoned them. That my absence changed something. 9 is a different number than 10. Would we have made different decisions? Would one more person have meant survival instead of death?" He died without answers. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, carried the weight of official lies for 40 years before finally speaking out about the bright spheres and his suspicions of military involvement. His confession came too late to matter officially, but it added weight to theories that the Soviet government had hidden the truth. The families were given bodies to bury, but some noted disturbing details: unusual skin coloration, a strange orange tint to some victims' hair and skin, tissue samples that seemed to have been removed during autopsy. They were never given full access to the autopsy reports. Some details were classified and remained so for decades. The pass where they died was later named Dyatlov Pass in Igor's honor, a memorial that acknowledges death without explaining it. And the questions multiplied rather than resolved. In 2019, Russian authorities announced they would reopen the case. 60 years after the incident, using modern forensic techniques and newly available evidence, they would finally provide closure. Their conclusion, released in 2020, avalanche, a specific type of avalanche, they said, a delayed slab avalanche that could occur hours after setting up camp, that could cause internal injuries without external trauma, that would explain the panic and flight. The families and researchers were not satisfied. The announcement felt like another cover-up, another official explanation that explained nothing while closing down investigation. Independent research has continued. Scientists have modeled the snow conditions. Physicists have analyzed the injury patterns. Historians have combed through declassified Soviet military documents, looking for evidence of weapons testing in the area during that time period. Some findings are suggestive. Documents confirm military activity in the region. Missile tests were conducted. Restricted zones existed, but direct evidence linking this to the deaths remains elusive. In 2023, a team of investigative journalists claimed to have found witnesses now in their 80s and 90s, who were military personnel in the area in 1959. According to these accounts, there was a military exercise involving new rocket technology. There was an incident. There were orders to suppress information, but these are testimonies from aging memories, filtered through decades and the fog of time. They are not proof, they are not certainty, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains officially explained and spiritually inexplicable. We have theories, we have possibilities, we have documents and autopsies and photographs and testimony. But we do not have truth, and perhaps that is the most disturbing element of all. Not what happened on that mountain, but how effectively it has been hidden. 9 people died in terror and confusion. Their families deserved answers. Instead, they received euphemisms and classifications and silence. For decades, the Soviet government treated this tragedy as a state secret, as if the deaths of 9 students on a hiking trip threatened national security. Why? That question hangs over this entire story like the cold over that mountain. Why was this case closed so quickly? Why were investigators ordered to ignore evidence? Why were documents classified? Why, 60 years later, does the official explanation still feel insufficient? The answer that haunts me, the one that keeps me awake after researching this case for months, is simple. Because they know what happened, and they cannot tell us. Someone knows. Someone in the Soviet military, or the Russian government that inherited its secrets, knows what happened on Khalat Syakh on February 1st, 1959. They know what those 9 people encountered. They know why radiation was on the clothing. They know what the lights in the sky were. They know why the investigation was shut down, and they have decided that we do not deserve to know. This transforms the Dyatlov Pass incident from a mystery into something darker, a demonstration of how easily truth can be buried, how effectively governments can hide what they choose to hide, how little power we have to demand answers even when 9 lives have been snuffed out in circumstances that scream for explanation. The victims left evidence: footprints in snow, cuts in fabric, bodies frozen in specific positions, injuries documented in medical files. They left photographs, journals, a timeline. They left everything investigators would need to understand what happened. And yet, here we are, 65 years later, still arguing about what killed them. That is not mystery. That is suppression. The story of the Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved, not because of what happened, but because of what has been hidden. 9 people died. 9 investigations were incomplete. 9 families were denied truth. And in that denial, in that official silence, we see something that should terrify us more than any theoretical weapon or natural disaster. We see how easily power can decide that our need to know is less important than their need to hide. But questions remain, questions that echo across decades. What were the lights in the sky that multiple witnesses reported? Why was a student hiking trip immediately classified as a state security matter? And most haunting of all, what did those 9 people see or hear that made walking barefoot into killing cold seem like the better choice? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the price we pay for living in a world where governments value secrecy over truth, where convenience trumps justice, where the dead cannot demand accountability. To this day, the pass remains accessible to hikers. Tour groups visit the site. People camp where the tent once stood. And some report, though these accounts are impossible to verify, feelings of intense dread when night falls, a sensation of being watched, an urge to flee that rises from nowhere and grips them with irrational force. Most dismiss it as imagination, as the power of knowing the history of that place. But some know better. Some feel that whatever happened there in 1950, 9 left something behind, not a ghost, perhaps, but an echo. A warning written in the very air of that mountain. Some terrors are too great to be contained by death, and some truths are too dangerous to ever be fully revealed. And on winter nights in the Ural Mountains, when the wind howls down from the peaks and the temperature plunges to depths that kill, when the snow lies deep and the darkness is absolute, locals still call it by its ancient name Kalatseak, Dead Mountain, the mountain that remembers, the mountain that keeps secrets, the mountain that took 9 souls and gave back only questions. If this journey through one of history's most disturbing mysteries resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering what kind of terror could drive experienced hikers to choose death over facing it, then this channel has more truths waiting in the darkness. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about what governments hide, what history buries, and what really lurks in the places we're told not to look. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than curiosity, if it made you question how much of what we call truth is simply the official version of events. And in the comments, I want to know, do you believe the Russian government knows what happened on that mountain? Do you think the families deserve the classified files even now, 65 years later? Or are some secrets meant to stay buried with the dead? Until next time, remember the most terrifying mysteries are not the ones we cannot solve, but the ones someone has decided we should not solve. And sometimes, that deliberate silence is the loudest scream of all.